So let me introduce our speaker. We are here for a specific reason, and that is because of this crisis. And crises can bring people closer together than ever before, especially this current pandemic. Couples are being forced closer than they've ever been with each other before. But also single people are forced to isolate themselves, and this has a lot of implications. What are the implications going to be? Is this a make or break situation, or is this just temporary? Are we going to see a baby boom in 9 months, or is it going to be just widespread divorce and breakup? Who knows? What happened to dating? How can technology help us to connect even physically? How are apps and online games helping us to connect with each other, if it's in a romantic setting or friendship or whatever? So we've invited the world's leading authority on sex tech to discuss all of these questions with you. Our speaker has very kindly decided to join us, even though it's 6 a.m. where she is. So please welcome the CEO of the Future of Sex, Bryony Cole, live from Melbourne, Australia. Bryony, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Sid.
Hi.
Thanks so much for having me. Good morning.
Very, very happy to have you here. Good evening, good night, everything. We're joined by people from all over the world. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm doing really well. Australia is doing pretty well considering, the rest of the world, we're doing pretty well. So it's great to be here. And, it's a really important time, I think, for sex tech, for people understanding what's happening and understanding that the intimacy and sex is a critical part of their lives. If they didn't understand that before, they certainly do now.
Absolutely. So just briefly, what does intimacy mean in a quarantine lockdown situation, and how is that redefining how we look at it?
Yeah, well, intimacy in a quarantine situation means different things to different people. If we think about the term intimacy, there's usually 4 dimensions to intimacy. It has to do with obviously the physical, but also that emotional connection, the intellectual connection you have, and shared experiences. So for some people, it's a really positive experience. They're sharing their close quarters with their partner, and they're having a lot of physical contact, perhaps connecting in a new way emotionally, and having like that intellectual sparring partner. Maybe they didn't know that their partner was really just like this person that they could have these in-depth conversations with. And of course, they're having a shared experience. So for some people, that's a real positive. For other people, they're isolated by themselves, so they don't have any physical contact. Maybe they're able to connect over Zoom like we are now and having that sort of mental connection or sharing their emotions, but lack of physical is really paining them. And for some people, isolating together, it's even worse, which we'll discuss, is, the pressurized container of just being in contact with that one person has brought new levels of intimacy that are perhaps unwelcome. So intimacy is meaning a lot of different things to people, and they're discovering their own sort of intimacy skills as well under lockdown.
Also their boundaries.
And their boundaries, and then whether they've been able to communicate their boundaries before or not. And what's interesting now is we have these new boundaries that we have to establish if our partners are, in another location, or a lover or someone we're dating, but yet, we're tired of doing Zoom calls or FaceTimes. How do we communicate boundaries around that when someone's like, can we have another FaceTime date? And, you need to preserve your energy, or you're just not feeling up to it. So I think we're finding these new ways that intimacy is being established, but also trying to create boundaries for ourselves inside that as well.
It's fascinating. Can I ask your opinion, your personal opinion? What
Sure.
are we in for? Is it going to be a baby boom or a global epidemic of breakups?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea that people have been floating in the media, is that there's going to be this baby boom, when in fact what's happening is the birth rate is declining, and the average birth rate should be 2.1. It's down to 1.47 here in Australia at the moment, but people aren't having babies because well, it's a stressful situation, and there is heightened anxiety around this pandemic that we're experiencing, but also the socioeconomic status is pretty bad for most people. People are experiencing job loss. Maybe they're not unable to access help from the government. And so it's actually a terrible time for people to be having a pregnancy. Also, on top of that is the added situation of this, the health situation and not wanting to go into hospital. So instead of experiencing a baby boom, which I think in theory it sounds really nice, we're at home with our partners, we're being intimate, and this is the perfect time to have a baby, it's probably the worst time to get pregnant, while acknowledging there are some people that went into this crisis and were pregnant and are really nervous right now about visiting hospitals. So I don't think we're going to experience a baby boom. I think we're going to experience the opposite for a while, and those effects probably won't be felt till 20 years after, as they usually are with that following generation. In terms of breakups and divorce rates, what we have seen so far with the sort of limited amount, we've only been in this situation a few months now, so we don't have enough research, definitely not academic research, but what anecdotally, if we talk to law firms, what we're finding out is, yes, the request rate of divorces and separation agreements has gone up. It's skyrocketed. People are way more interested in filing for divorce now. We've seen that happen in China and Wuhan at the center of the crisis. But now, locally for me in Australia, we're also talking to firms here that are saying, yes, the traffic to their website's gone up, but also this request for more information around separations. We're not seeing divorce rates actually in the figures yet reflected, because most people aren't filing for divorce right now while they're living with their partner. That's something they'll have to go through after isolation and go through those paperworks, but certainly people are considering it. So with that being said, it is, as we said before, with intimacy, this pressurized container for relationships. So a lot of people are considering divorce, but also a lot of people are in new relationships and they've had to, like in the UK, where the government suggested either break up or move in together and take the relationship to the next level. So a lot of people are in these new relationships and they're discovering, wow, this person's actually wonderful, and I've had this chance to, discover what they're like under unusual circumstances, and we still get along. So I think there's a lot of positives in that too, and that people are finding, being able to find their partners quicker or pressure test their relationship a lot quicker than we would normally. I think there's an acceleration in 1 month that probably would have taken 2 years for some couples.
Right. That's incredible. I like the word they used just now, the acceleration. So this pressure cooker situation is making everything happen on a faster track than it normally would. So what does that mean? What implications does that have on sex, and what happens after the quarantine is lifted?
Yeah, so I think, on a personal level for people in terms of the implications of sex, some people are having a lot more sex and some people are having no sex at all. I think when we think about the sex tech industry, at a professional business level, what we're seeing is sex tech is booming. So even if people aren't having sex with other people, they're having sex with themselves a lot. We look at the sex toy market, which is increased, some would say, by 850%. So 850% is a huge increase for any market. We're expecting sex tech to boom after this, as well as, of course, the porn industry is seeing a huge increase, and dating apps. People are downloading dating apps a lot more and using them with a lot more frequency, especially now that there's that video chat inside there. So what does this mean for sex afterwards? Perhaps on a, personal level, it's a lot more enjoyable because people have had a chance to explore themselves. They've had time, right? They've had time to understand their bodies, try something different. I think if we look at just the sex toy market alone, what's interesting is people are buying not sort of that first time toy, but maybe they're experimenting with something they wouldn't have normally tried, or that second purchase, which is really interesting. So it hints to the exploration and the curiosity that people are indulging in now that they have time. I think as well, a stigmatized part of the industry has always been male sex toys, and we're looking at that as a really interesting market now where, single men are looking for toys because they can't have physical intimacy with someone else, and probably wouldn't have tried that before because there's so much stigma around it. So the toy market's really interesting. Hopefully people are more sexually aware or sexually woke out of this pandemic and able to enjoy themselves more and know their bodies a bit more.
I find it fascinating that that these things are sort of increasing a lot, because this quarantine has taken a lot of things away from us, just in terms of what we can take for granted. And because we're in 2020, we're in such of a immediate, instant gratification culture that no, I can't just go for a drink wherever I want to. I can't just hang out with my friends wherever I want to. I can't go to the bar whenever I want to. But one thing I can control, one thing I can take care of is my immediate circle and how I treat my body. So I'm going to treat myself sort of in compensation for the things that I've lost. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, in some ways that's a welcome rest for some people. I think the thing to note is everyone's having their own experience of this quarantine. You know, if you talk to any one of your friends, they're having a very different experience. That might be a different sort of hell, or it might be a different, you know, sort of heaven for them. They might be really enjoying themselves. But what's true is people are having a lot more time alone to contemplate themselves, right? And so people that are isolating alone, being more aware of their bodies and turning to whether it's toys or just themselves and experimentation can be a really positive thing, and something that often, especially for women, they don't give themselves that time out to really do in other circumstances. Yeah.
We have a question. So Jens Olsen asks, so it doesn't look like a baby boom is likely, but just in case that happens, how would you dub this generation? We have boomers, millennials, and zoomers. So what's next?
Well, if we're talking about if zoomers, I didn't know zoomers existed. I love that. If we're all zoomers, or the young kids are today, I think we've talked about coronials, right, as the babies coming out of the coronavirus. And there's some fun words, you know, going around, but that actually brings up a really interesting point, I think, is talking about this next generation that are growing up with this. Like, what's it like to have parents under living with your parents under lockdown right now? And I think teenagers are probably the ones suffering the most. You know, that's a point where your personal development, your sexual identity, your expression, all those things are starting to form in those early teen years. And to be under lockdown right now is actually really painful for that generation. And I think it's going to be really fascinating to see how they cope, and I know parents are scrambling to help them, but also how they emerge out of this, you know, with their identities and their sexuality at such an important and crucial time for development. And, you know, I don't have any answers, and I think that we'll see out of that. But yeah, maybe the term to answer the question, Jens, is maybe it's coronials. I'm trying to think. There's another term that's being floated around as well on that. I can't remember right now.
I suggest Co-Kid 19. All right. So what, in your estimation, what are the positive and negative trends throughout the world of the pandemic when it comes to our private lives, our personal lives, or even just our intimate circle?
Yeah, well, I think, again, you know, the positive trend is dependent on what your situation is. What we're finding is people have to become better communicators. Like, if anything came out of this that was a generalized trend, is that people have been forced to communicate if they want to have any sort of intimacy. You can't just have physical touch anymore. That doesn't cut it. And you've got to be an excellent communicator in your relationships in order to, you know, manage your own mental health and the wellness of others. So people are learning a lot better how to communicate their feelings and their emotions because they've been forced to, right? No one's given them a book and said, here, read the, you know, 5 languages of love or something to help your relationship. It's actually a bit of a pressure cooker situation where to survive it, you have to become a better communicator. I think, you know, the other positives we talked about is, yeah, sure, people are exploring their bodies more, or perhaps they're having better sex. For a lot of people, the other trend is, well, yeah, they've really decided or discovered the person that they're with isn't the one for them, and, you know, they're probably having a lot less sex. So it goes both ways because everyone is having their own experience, and on that macro level, communication is better. I think for the sex tech industry, we're really excited seeing people using sex tech a lot more. I think that drives innovation in the industry. It's also inviting a lot more people to get involved in sex tech industry. If we think about like what are the three things people are really buying right now? It's food, it's alcohol, and it's sex toys. And so the industry is booming, but it's also, I think, a light bulb for a lot of entrepreneurs thinking, well, hang on, this seems like a really interesting industry now that it's so popular. And also I think the conversation around things is changing around sexuality. How do I get involved? So I think out of this, another key trend is, sex tech is going to have a lot more of a spotlight on it in terms of entrepreneurs and investors attracted to the space.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely fascinating because skeptics might say this is a bubble and it will burst. But I think that what you just said is absolutely key, that it will shed more light on the industry, and it'll open up a lot of the conversations and help to destigmatize sex and sexuality, and not just in the Eastern world, in the Western world as well, everywhere, especially what you said about men using toys, really breaking down these barriers.
Yeah, it is. And it's really exciting to see. Yeah, I don't think sex tech is going away anytime soon. And I think actually, this cultural conversation that we're all having because of this crisis is actually really enhancing the state of sex tech and moving it away from, which it typically was, and we talked about this at Brain Bar last year, this idea that people think sex tech is about sex robots, when in fact it's about so much more than sex robots. And I think what we're finding now that we're all isolating at home is how critical it is to have human intimacy. And in fact, robots, or no matter how good the toy is, it's never going to replace the real thing. And the real thing is another human. And so for me, it's been, really exciting to see the industry conversation shift as well. And a lot of the interest in it is no longer about, well, robots replace us, because I think what we're all finding is, well, no, robots will not replace a human connection.
But I think one of the key things you just said was that it doesn't replace the real thing. But for some people, maybe the real thing is only associated with trauma and violence and difficulty. So sex tech can really be a very therapeutic way to get past these sorts of barriers that help us understand our bodies and our sexuality and our place in society in an adult way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if we want to talk a little bit about the impact of sex tech on trauma in this current, pandemic, is people are taking a pause. Like this is actually a beautiful time for healing for some people, in that they don't have to interact with a lot of people and go about their normal daily lives. And so it is really an opportunity for them to address their healing and, their bodies and how their bodies feel, and become more aware of that, and things that typically when we, have these experiences, we want to push them off, or we want to push them away because we're like, well, I'll deal with that later. And for some people, that later is right now, like this is the prime time for reflection and for understanding yourself and going through that. And with teletherapy being so sort of widespread now, access to therapists via a screen is also preferable for some people that have been too embarrassed or maybe, reluctant to talk to someone. They can talk to someone, but they also have a lot of time on their hands to sort of go through it by themselves.
That's wonderful. We have another question. So Edward Tao asks, any dating tips for a period like this?
Great. Yeah, dating tips. Well, people have had a lot of time now to do video dating, right? And I think one of the things that's emerging now with the dating is video dating is going to become the new normal, the FaceTime dates. I was a big proponent of FaceTime dates and checking in to really see the person before going on a date beforehand. But now I think, we have no choice. So with more video chatting, I think one sort of tip or thing people are rubbing up against right now is like, well, what do we do beyond that initial first conversation? Because while you can have one video date, it kind of becomes a bit tiring, right, to have multiple video dates. So a tip would be to find, how do you find this interesting? Like, can you play a game? Can you, I know everyone suggests like setting up the dinner and having a FaceTime date over dinner, but what are their, what are their fun things for you to do over video, whether that's a quiz or, we just released a game at the Future of Sex Lab called Wheel of Foreplay, which is really fun. It's a spin the wheel. It's a site. You go to wheelofforeplay.com and you can, choose cards and they give you different ideas or games to play together. So I think gaming is actually really interesting, having a really interesting moment, because it's allowing people that sort of like space that you would usually have when you're going to order a drink or something, that sort of that space in between in-depth conversations. Not every video date needs to be this like deep emotional conversation. So how do you bring play into your date, I think, is a really important sort of idea to play with. But I also think for a tip is like limit it to 30 minutes. And some dating apps actually have this inbuilt where you can only chat for 30 minutes. But I think a 30-minute chat window provides you with enough time to sort of get to know the person, have some fun, and get out. Some people, I know the longest video date that's happened over the coronavirus has been 11 hours and 4 minutes. So some people are going for all-nighters over video, which is fine. But I think for most people, it's going to be hard to find constant conversation to connect to. Don't feel bad about that. Just, set that. The great thing about being on video is you can sort of make an excuse pretty easily. But I think that also conserves your energy and gives you the best foot forward for that first couple of dates.
So the lessons that we can take from that, is that going to change our dating game post quarantine?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, taking a sip of water over here,
That's okay.
Stealing a sip in between. But yeah, what I think's happening now is this normalization of video chat. We're finding that this is in majority of dating apps now. Some dating apps are leading with that as a product feature. Has dating changed forever? I think overall the mating and dating game hasn't changed, and I think it will go back to the way it was. If we're in this sort of lockdown for years, I think that's when really we see these huge societal shifts and things happening. Right now, I think we tend to either romanticize or fantasize or get that fearful sort of terrorize about like, oh my gosh, this is completely changing the way we'll date forever. I think media tend to grab onto those fear-mongering headlines too. But for me, I think we're going to see a bounce back, albeit we'll all be honed on our virtual dating and flirting skills, and we'll be a lot more dexterous with sexting and things like that. But overall, I think, dating and mating is dating and mating, and evolutionary won't change that much.
Great. We have another question from Bernadette Bahi. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name. She says, I'm interested in how technology can help in long distance relationships. Ooh, this is a great question. Great.
Yeah. So I think it's, there's been a lot of hype around teledildonics for long distance relationships. And if you're not familiar with teledildonics, that refers to super connected sex toys. So toys that would be connected via long distance over Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. Now, if you speak to Kiru or a teledildonics manufacturer, certainly there's a ton of traffic being directed to those sites and a ton of interest in those and more purchases. But sometimes, and we're talking about having sex here with long distance relationships, sometimes it's just easier to turn on FaceTime or Skype or even Zoom, and have virtual sex that way without the toys and connections. Although some people find it really fun, or being able to remote control another person's vibrator. That is, as we opened with around intimacy and relationships, like relationships are not just sex, they are intimacy. So emotional, intellectual, shared experiences, they're also key parts of this, like the relationship building blocks. And how do you maintain those? I think that's also really stressful. And I think some ways that technology is helping there is obviously providing people on their own to sort of get some more intimacy skills, whether that's participating in online courses or virtual summits or being able to access a teletherapist. I think also it's really important to think about like the stress relief components of technology, whether that is toys, whether that's playing Wheel of Foreplay or a game. I think that's really fun. Also, on like that like lighthearted shared experience aspect of intimacy, being able to do a workout together or go to a Netflix party together. Like these are ways we're seeing that people in long distance relationships are adapting, as well as obviously trying new things together. Now teledildonics are quite expensive. They're typically a couple of $100 versus your average sex toy. So I think another fun way that couples who want to be physically intimate while apart can engage with that is just going on a site, like going on a sex toy site and buying one together can be a really fun experience as well. So it's interesting to hear the creative ways people are coming together, but not ignoring like all those building blocks of intimacy that make a relationship great. You know, you can't just be on teledildonics all day.
Absolutely. I think one of the tricky things about being in a long distance relationship is a lot of people say that they only work if you know when you're going to stop being long distance, and then establish that physical proximity. But then what this is doing is putting a lot of uncertainty on us. So are there any emotional hacks or whatever that can build that intimacy and help to mitigate those circumstances?
Yeah, you know, I think that uncertainty is creating a lot of anxiety in relationships, and people not knowing when they might see each other again does put, again, a lot of pressure on relationships to make that decision ultimately whether they're going to go ahead with it or not. You know, I don't think there's any way to hack our emotions around that other than to be aware of them. And for some people, that means making the decision and communicating effectively with that partner. You know, hey, I've really got to focus on my family right now. I'm really worried about my parents. Like, I don't think this is going to work. And being able to close that relationship out, even though it's painful, because they can't, you know, they don't have the bandwidth to let that drag on. And so I think that's a reality for a lot of people, which, yeah, let's be honest, that really sucks. But in new relationships, that's what people are finding is how much capacity do I have to hold on to this during an uncertain time? For other people, they're welcoming this as a time to work, you know, on themselves. And for other people that are in relationships, have been in them, but are just apart for this time, it is stressful. I don't know if I have like the answer for that. I think people are creating their own journeys around that, and that there's no silver bullet answer around that other than, you know, find out what feels good to you. You know, do you want to text more? Is FaceTiming every night what you want? Communicate what you want, and then the other person has to communicate what they want too. Maybe that other person is working 9 to 5 and can't be texting you all day, but a good compromise for them is chatting, you know, 3 times a week and setting that up. So I think the only way to sort of feel a little bit better about all this uncertainty is to try and put some structure in that, which is, you know, it's trying to put control over an uncertain situation, but finding out what feels good for you and what sort of structures and foundations you can put in place for your relationship, whether that's a weekly check-in or, you know, a 3 texts a day or whatever, is okay. Like, don't feel bad about asking for what you want and what you need right now, and also negotiating that with your partner. Sounds like a business deal when I talk about it like that, doesn't it?
Well, I'm a business guy, so that makes sense to me. We have one more question from Ildi Nudge. She asks, could the rapid digitalization of intimate time spent together online have some privacy and security risks?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you brought this up, Ildi, because it does. You know, this is something we can't ignore. It's a major factor of us meeting online today, and we've read about this in the news, you know, Zoom jacking, Zoom hijacking, basically any video conference. The safest way to be, you know, sexting is to not sext at all, you know, or to be nude on the internet. Well, that doesn't exist. So I think there are a lot of privacy and security concerns from people, and rightfully so. You know, I think there's limited safety turns we can take, really. If we want to be able to sext online or have virtual sex, like, you are opening yourself up to hacking and to anyone accessing that. It's never going to be 100% watertight and safe. And I think that's sort of something that people have to consider and feel their level of comfort with it. I don't think anyone, I don't think we're going to see a mass like stopping of sexting right now, or virtual sex, if people suddenly awoke to the fact that, yes, like 100% you can be hacked and people can access your images. It's a scary thought, but it's a real one. And it's assessing your level of comfortability with that. There's no way around that. I guess scraping the metadata of your phone, like location, your photos is one hack we've seen, but we're talking about video now, which is not the most secure.
Thank you for that question, LD. So, Bryony, you've talked a lot about sex tech. So can you give the audience some examples of sex tech that the average person would be familiar with? You said it's not having sex with robots exclusively. It's a broader spectrum of things. So can you enlighten us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, when people think of sex tech, I think the easiest way to describe that is sex tech is any technology designed to enhance sexuality. So while robots may spring to mind, or perhaps VR and VR porn, there's so many other ways that technology and sexuality are combining today to bring us pleasure and to also help us with our health. So sex tech can also include things like sex education platforms like O-School, OMG Yes. It can also include teledildonics, which we talked about before, so it's Wi-Fi or Bluetooth-enabled sex toys. It also includes sexual health, whether that's teletherapy or apps for increasing your pelvic floor strength, or maybe it's actually products and services that help with premature ejaculation or other health issues like that. We also have apps and technology for sex crimes and for assault reporting. That's also considered sex tech. And then, yes, of course, for pleasure, for relationships, we have amazing sex tech that helps us either go through breakups with apps like Mend, or, have better sex, combat pain with products and services like ONUT. And these are all things that you can find on my presentation on Brain Bar, which is on the Brain Bar YouTube. If you look up Future of Sex, we went through all these different sort of verticals of sex tech and why it's worth $30 billion. And I do say, coming out of the coronavirus, I think sex tech will be worth a lot more than $30 billion. And you should be thinking about, if, perhaps you've lost your job or you're thinking about a new career, think about whether you might have an idea for sex tech. Maybe you want to join a company, maybe you want to invest, or, maybe you want to start your own thing. Typically, I get, 3 to 4 emails a week asking, how do I get started in sex tech? And so I think if you're thinking about it, now's a good time. We're opening up a sex tech school at Future of Sex as well to really help people get, the foundations of the industry knowledge about sex tech, who they should know, how they might approach investors, and the common challenges of this market. It's not like another small business industry. I think we all know that, but there are some challenges around manufacturing, around advertising, around finding money for this sort of industry that are unique to that. So Sex Tech School is something, if you're interested in, you can contact me about as well. And hopefully, we see an influx of innovation and entrepreneurs into the sex tech world very soon.
Excellent. I want to put out one more call out to the audience. So we're almost reaching our time with Bryony here. So if you have any questions or any comments, please enter them now, and then we'll get them across to her. So, Bryony, are people being opportunistic in the crisis? And if so, how are they being opportunistic in your industry? And what are the possibilities that they're seeing? What are the gaps that they're seeing that they can fill?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting, I think, for a lot of people that have been existing in this industry before. They're having to take their businesses online like much, the rest of the world, right, and other industries, is how do I take my my business online. So we're seeing a lot of that in terms of delivery of sex education and sex toys and therapy. I think that's the biggest one, is sex therapists that commonly are meeting people in person are going online. I think people are also, they're coming in from other industries. We joke about the rise of OnlyFans accounts, but a lot of people who have lost their job are finding new work in sex work online. And I think that's a growing sort of industry that people are experimenting with, probably haven't, considered that before, and are now finding it quite a lucrative career for some. And then a lot of sex workers are also taking their sex work online. I think that's another area that typically, they hadn't considered before, and now they have to go online, especially if they don't have any job security, which in the US is definitely true. They don't have access to stimulus packages and government support, and so they have to find new ways to engage in sex work online. So I think that's an interesting part of the opportunistic side of coronavirus, but also, as we mentioned before, people that hadn't considered a career pathway in sex tech are thinking about it. And if we think about the career pathways for sex tech, it isn't just sex work. It isn't just starting your own company. It could be joining a company. It could be becoming a media producer. Maybe you're thinking of starting a podcast or a blog around education or sexuality or even sex tech. So I think there's a couple of different pathways there that are really interesting in terms of where people are going, how do I take this online, or how do I join this industry?
Excellent. We have a couple of questions. Jens Olsen again. Hi, Jens. He says, I always assumed that Japan is at the forefront of sex tech. Is that true, or is there a different country that might be more advanced in sex tech?
Yeah, it depends. Really depends what vertical, I think, in sex tech that we're thinking about. Definitely, we see these interesting examples coming out of Japan right now with Gatebox, which again, at Brain Bar, we showed the video of Gatebox, so you can look it up on YouTube, as this virtual girlfriend, this virtual assistant, like a home assistant that also sends you emotional text messages and is this hologram character that, you can actually marry. And we've seen, I think, 3,800 or something by now, hologram marriages in Japan. So that was, I would say, fairly advanced, or to even alternative structures of relationships and intimacy in Japan. And in some ways, I think, Japan is just an interesting culture of itself that is, it relates very differently to other cultures. The technology there is certainly interesting. Another interesting fact, which I forgot to share about Japan, is their hotel firm is now offering their hotel rooms to couples that may want some space. And so a lot of couples are now, because the work culture in Japan, we know that it's so high. People are working like 20 hours a day now, and now they're faced at being in quarantine and being at home all the time. They're realizing, they're those couples that realize, oh my gosh, I don't know if I really like this partner. In fact, the hashtag Corona Divorce was trending in Japan. They started this hashtag. And so hotels are offering these rooms where, spouses can go and stay for months at a time to get some distance from their partners. So I think in some ways we tend to other Japanese culture and think, wow, they're more advanced, or they're totally different. They're marrying holograms. And in many other ways, they're just the same, as us. And this tendency that other Japan is not true. So that's a long way of answering the question of whether Japan is more advanced. I think they certainly are experimenting, and the innovations coming out of there are very different looking to what we might see out of Europe or out of the US. In terms of hubs of sex tech, I think in the sex toy vertical also, the US is doing really interesting things, especially in that women of sex tech community, which really is located in New York and is the hub of, female entrepreneurs that are working in sex tech, as well as the UK. I know Love Honey has a designer sex toy competition open right now globally. I'm actually a judge on it. But if you were thinking you would have a new idea, I think that's an interesting place to submit your idea, and you can win a lot of money there and perhaps have a profitable business. That's an interesting pathway. But yeah, Japan is an interesting area to look at, as is the US, as is Europe. It just really depends if you're interested in robotics or toys, or where are you interested in. The sex toy market, the sex tech market exists everywhere.
Excellent. Jens, I hope that answered your question. Brian, we've got a juicy question here for you. I think you'll like this one. Where's the humanity in the future if sex tech takes over sexuality?
Yeah, I think at the core of sex tech and any person that's sort of interested in this industry, the core belief is that humanity is the key central part of this, and that technology is only enhancing our experience. Technology isn't meant to supplant the human at all, or the humanity of this. In fact, technology is there as an aid or a tool to support and enhance. So that might be, aiding in terms of like assault reporting and better assault reporting. It might be an aid for painful sex or premature ejaculation. It might be for more pleasure. So for me, and I think for a lot of people in this industry, the idea is that humanity is at the core, and that we truly believe that technology can help us in some way. And that's sort of the key idea of sex tech.
Good. So, Akash, I hope you're reassured that robots are not taking over. We've got one final question. This comes from Elise Pregun. So do you think people will come out of this pandemic more sex positive? Do you think that there might be a change in the general mindset?
It certainly feels like people are going to come out of this pandemic a lot more sex positive. I think we're seeing, people are realizing that sex is really important to them and that they're ready to have those conversations. Perhaps because they're at home alone or they're private, they have more sort of time to reflect. But definitely, we were primed already, I think, going into this, looking at the cultural conversations and how things were moving. There was a lot of, at least in the US where I'm based, there was a lot of sort of pop culture around this, talking about pleasure in an open way, where previously in the 90s, of course, we had Sex and the City in the US, in New York in particular, talking about vibrators and sex and female sexual pleasure. We had the release of 50 Shades of Grey. So we had these moments already. They often presented female pleasure as something that was strange or funny, instead of just truly pleasurable. And I think, coming towards 2020, we had Gwyneth Paltrow as a celebrity icon talking about female pleasure. We had the Goop Lab on Netflix. We had a lot of sex positive shows. I'm not sure how that was in Europe, but it felt like the conversation had been changing. And of course, off the back of this most recent moments, we also had the Me Too and the Time's Up movements, which really propelled this conversation around sexuality in the workplace or out, or just like expression and what that meant. So I think we were primed going into this for a bit of a shift in conversation. And now again, coronavirus has accelerated so many things. It's also accelerated this conversation around sexuality, people getting comfortable with it, people becoming more curious. The amount of media requests I get about this every day now is a lot higher, because people are wanting information. They're wanting to know, just like we're talking today about, like, what's going to happen? How do I save my marriage? So I think there's a lot more attention, which is always a good thing on this, because it does help people understand it more and ultimately get to a more sex positive mindset.
Fantastic. Bryony, I'd like to thank you for your time. Can you let our audience know where they can follow you on social media if you want to plug your stuff there?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me at Future of Sex on Instagram. I think that's the easiest way to get to me. I'm also on Twitter. If you search Bryony Cole, which my name is there, and you'll find me on Twitter. And I'll see you soon.
All right, and Bryony will also be at the next Brain Bar series, so you can check her out there. Bryony, thank you very much for your time.
Okay, of course.
Have a great day. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.